This tutorial will cover creating the Superman sequence for the Batman vs. Superman titles teaser. We'll start by creating a new sequence. I'll hit Command-N on the keyboard, and I'll make sure that the sequence is 720 by 480, and I'll start out with a duration of 14 seconds. I'll find the image for the background, Gotham.jpg, and I'll put that into position. I'll extend the background out to the 14-second duration I want, and then I'm going to keyframe the position from right to left. I'll put the image at the far left-hand side of the comp window. Making sure I'm at the beginning of my timeline, I'll hit P for position, drop the first keyframe. I'll go to the end of the 14-second sequence by hitting End on the keyboard, and I'll drag the image across the screen till I see the right-hand edge of it against the right-hand edge of the comp window. Next, I'm going to put Henry Cavill onto the screen, the Superman picture, and I'll drag his face over to the right-hand side of the comp window. It's going to enter from the right-hand side and stop somewhere around here. Just as all the other sequence, we need a 2-second lag for the rest of the animated content so we can have a bit of a dissolve from one sequence to the other. I'll go to my timeline and I'll punch in 200, hit return, and now I'm going to stretch the clip out a bit. Now this is where he's going to be coming out the screen, so I'm going to cut it there by holding down the Option and hitting the open bracket. I'll now drag him off to the right, holding my Shift key. I'll hit P for position, drop the first keyframe for position, and we'll have him come onto screen for a 3-second duration, which will make it 5 seconds by the time he's on screen. I'll put 500 in my time code. Now I'll click, start to drag, and then hit the Shift key and drag until I have what I want. So something like that will work pretty well. Now we're also going to change the scale a little bit so that we're not crowding the left-hand side of the screen where the full figure Superman must come. So I'll hit S on the keyboard, and I'm going to drop the scale down a bit. I'll make it about 85%. And once I've saved it, I'm going to add a mask to make his face blur out a bit on the top and perhaps the right. So I'm going to hit Q on the keyboard, and it takes me to the toolbar where the mask elements are. Now I have to make sure the clip's selected, because if I think I'm dragging a mask onto an image and it's not selected, it's going to give me a layer not unlike a Photoshop or Illustrator shape. So I'll go and I'll start with the elliptical tool and I'll click and drag. Once I've got it on my comp window, I'll get my Move tool, double click on it, and I'll move it to where I might want it to be. I'm going to go down and I'm going to open up the mask effects in the layer window. And I'll start by putting a feather on it. And I guess I'll make the mask feather about 93. And I'll probably move it down at the top of the head a bit. Now this gets very subjective. As long as you're using these tools and know where they are, that's the takeaway from this tutorial. Now I want him to be a little bit more in keeping with the colors that we see on the screen here. If we were to take a look at the finished one, you'll see he's got kind of a blue pallor. So with that clip selected, I'm going to go to Effects, and I'm going to go to Color Correction, and I'm going to go to Hue Saturation. And then the Hue Saturation effect, as it appears in the left-hand corner under the Effects window, I'm going to go in and I'm going to turn that dial. And you'll notice that as you turn it and start to go to about, I guess if we were looking at a clock, it would probably be like 7 o'clock-ish. I'm going to set it at 188 degrees, and it will give us the blue that we're looking for. So now I'm going to go back and play the animation to see what we've got so far. So that's looking pretty good. Next, we're going to animate the full figure that will rise from the bottom of the composition. Now, before we introduce the full figure of Superman, we have to animate the cape. I'm going to select his image in the project window, And I'm going to create a new composition based on the proportions of that. So I'll click and drag it over the red, green, and blue button at the bottom of the project window. And now if I were to zoom back, he's filling a composition that is roughly a square, but the full figure is in it. I'm going to turn off the background. We're going to be using a tool on the toolbar that is called a puppet position pin. And it's just like Photoshop, but we're able to keyframe this. Another thing you want to bear in mind is when you use this, that as soon as you start to drop those points around the perimeter of the figure, it automatically drops the first keyframe. So make sure the playback head is at the beginning of that timeline. I'll click on the puppet tool and I'll go in and I'll pin down the figure where I want it to remain stationary, applying quite a few of these points. And then I'll place a few near the cape. So I'll put one here, maybe one there, perhaps one here. And I'm going to pin down this arm and shoulder along here so the body doesn't distort when we introduce new keyframes. I'm going to go to second number 1, and I'm going to open up the effects tab for the Puppet Warp. Now it's going to take quite a bit of real estate on the screen, so I'm going to reduce the scale of the screen itself so I can go in and I can open up the mesh and then all of the deform layers for the keyframes we've introduced. I'm going to deselect everything and I'll go in and I'll start to move the ones that will kind of imply that the cape is moving around. And if you feel that you need to add more to the body that needs to remain stationary, you can go ahead and do that as well. Now I want this to be a complete cycle. So what I need to do now is to copy and paste all the keyframes at the beginning to second number 2. So I'll click in my time code, punch in 200, and then I'm going to select all the points at the beginning of the timeline. So I'll start to click and drag, and perhaps as many as I can. If I have to, I'll move down, and holding the shift key I'll add those as well. And now that I have them all, I'll hit Command C to copy and then Command V to paste. So if I were to deselect everything and put my render bar end at that 2-second interval by hitting N, I can now preview it. So I'll zoom in on it a bit so we see this on screen a little bit larger. I'll hit home and I'll tap the space bar. So you can see now it's a looping cycle. Now rather than copy and paste this for perhaps the 4 or 5 seconds that we need it, we're going to export it as a QuickTime movie with an alpha channel. I'm going to go to Composition and I'm going to choose Add to Render Queue, and I'll click on Not Yet Specified next to Output to, the blue text. I'll direct it to my folder and I'll name it appropriately, and then I'm going to click on the blue word Lossless, and I'm going to change the channels from RGB to RGB alpha. I'm going to confirm that the compression codec is animation, so I'll click on Format Options just to make sure it does say animation. That would assure that I would get the alpha channel. I'll click OK, and I'll click OK again. Now one thing I also want to point out, in order to get that alpha channel, you have to make sure that background is turned off as well. Because if you were to select alpha channel RGB in the output, you would still get the black background if it's turned on in the comp window. Now I'm going to click on Render. I'm going to go back to the composition and I'm going to import that QuickTime movie in. Now I want this to kind of take place at the same time that the larger portrait is coming in from the right hand side. So I'm going to click and drag, put it on screen, and I'm going to hold the shift key and snap that clip to the beginning of where the face comes on screen, the 2-second interval. I'll hit I on the keyboard so I go to the beginning of that clip, and I'm going to zoom back and I'm going to put it over on the right hand side. I'm going to scale this first before we change the position. So I'll hit S on the keyboard and I'll drop it down so the full figure is on the screen. Now that I have him scaled, I'm going to increase the time, because if I drag through the timeline now, he disappears after the 2-second loop that we created. I'm going to right click on that .mov in the project window, and I'm going to go to Interpret Footage Main, and I'm going to change the loop to 20. And I'll just drag it out to the duration of the comp. Now I want this figure to be in this position when the face comes on screen. So I'm going to shift and drag and snap the playback head to the position key where the portrait is on screen. So you'll need to open up your layer to use that for reference. It's at 5 seconds. Once I've done that, I'm going to hit P for position. And I'm going to drop the first keyframe for the Superman in his cape. Now I want that to be off screen when we get to the beginning of the sequence for the portrait, which is at 2 seconds. I'll put my playback head 2 seconds, and I'll click and drag the full-figured Superman image off the bottom of the screen. So if we play, we should have something similar to this. Next, we're putting the text with Henry Cavill's name on it. And if you recall, in the other sequences, we copy and pasted one of the text layers to keep it consistent in size and color and stroke without having to rebuild it each time. So I've taken one from the previous comp, changed it to Henry Cavill, and now I'm ready to start the animation process. The text is going to begin animating after both of the images are on screen. So I'm going to hold the Shift key and I'll snap this to the keyframe at 5 seconds. And now I'm ready to start animating this. I'll give it a little bit more time, and I think I want to have a 3-second interval in which the name comes from the upper left-hand corner and comes to rest somewhere down in this area. Just as we animate the Superman, I'm going to place it where I want it to be when it comes to rest, move forward to 8 seconds, and put the first keyframe in for position. So I'll hit P. And I'm going to change the scale of this as well. So I'll hold down the Shift key and hit S. And now I can drop the first key for both of those functions. Now I'll put the playback head at the beginning of the text layer. And I'll drag up and off the left-hand corner. And I'll scale it so that it diminishes in size as well. Now I want it to come in and I want it to dip a bit rather than come straight in. So I'll put my playback head probably like this, and I'll just drag that text element on the composition window so that it sweeps a bit. Next, we're going to be putting an echo effect on, and in order to do that we have to put it in its own pre-composed layer. I'm going to start by putting the playback head at the beginning of that text layer at the 5-second interval. I'll select the clip, I'll go to Layer at the top of the user interface, Pre-composed Layer, and I'll just change it to Henry Cavill text. And I'm going to cut it there just for the visual reference, so I'll hold the Option key and hit the open bracket next to the letter P. And now I know where my text begins. Now I'm going to drag through the timeline a bit just to see this as it's in a position where it's in the process of moving. Now I'm going to go to the effects, and I'm going to go down to time, and I'm going to choose time echo. And you'll see that the text characters have been duplicated. Now the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to change the echo time to -0.3. It'll separate out those repeated text elements. I'm going to change the echo number to 5. And then I'm going to go down to decay, and I'm going to drag with my left mouse over the blue number next to that, and I guess maybe I'll drop it down to about 0.7. I'll put my playback head back at the beginning of the timeline, tap the space bar to preview what I've got. And that's pretty much what we need to do for this sequence.